Alright, so in the previous video we have learned how to use the mustache syntax to render something from the data object inside our HTML file. And now let's move forward to directives. We used one directive in the previous video, the vhtml directive, to render the title HTML property which had a tag inside an HTML tag inside the string. So we need to use that directive for to be able to render the correct element onto the page, like we see here. So we have the two titles, and inside here we see that we have rendered the first one with the class of title and the second one correctly, which has the span inside with the class of page. Now, so the HTML directive is not the only directive that we have. What it is a directive? A directive is essentially something that we put inside our HTML tag and apply effects to the DOM element when its expression changes. It's used for us to be able to render something onto the page while working with attributes, so working with HTML attributes. And because we have used the double curly bracket syntax to render something between an opening and closing HTML tag, but inside the tag itself we cannot use this kind of syntax, so we have to use a directive. And the directive that works on every attribute is the vbind directive, and it's used exactly to enable us as developers to bind something to an attribute. The vbind directive is one of the directives that takes arguments, and these are specified after the columns. Let's see, I'll show you in a minute what I mean. So what goes after the column is the attribute, the HTML attribute, like an ID, a class, an href, or something like that. Let's delete what is inside here. Let's create an anchor tag. So let's say that we want to bind this href attribute to something that is inside the data object. We have to use this vbind directive and then add column. So what is after? Everything after the column is should be the argument for the vbind directive, and it's the actual HTML attribute. So let's say how we can make this work. We could say in here, you know, that from the previous example with the VHTML, what's inside the quotes is now an expression. So if we write here URL between quotes, this is going to read from the data attribute and look for a property called URL. So if we need to dynamically assign an attribute like an href or even a class, we can bind it with the view between the view instance and its relative tag, and it will enable us to look for for properties inside the data object. So let's see this vbind in action and actually start connecting an ID and a class attributes to something inside the data object. So we will see how they work. So let's delete this one that now we don't need, and let's see div, and then we will add the vbind directive here, and we bind the class of this element, and we bind it with something called dynamic class. So this can be anything you want. and then another bind directive, and we bind it to the attribute ID, and the attribute ID is going to be the same, dynamic ID in this case. So in here we can say wherever we want, lorem 10. Okay, so now we have these and this one. So we have two properties that we actually need to define inside this element, so this view instance. So let's create them right now. Let's add them here. So after the projects array, we can say dynamic. Let's copy that so we don't have to type. Dynamic class. It's something like let's call it projects, and then we can add something here, dynamic ID, and we say projects section. Okay, so now if we now that all we have done is simply define two new properties inside our data object, so the dynamic project section and the dynamic class projects, and these two properties we have assigned their respective values, and thanks to the data binding on the attributes, our HTML tag will now render the following content. So what is inside the dynamic ID and dynamic class onto the page and replace it as we expect. So inside the class we will see the projects, and then inside the ID we will see the project section. So let's try this out. So this is the root element, and we have this div that we created, which has an ID of project section and a class of projects. So that works, of course it does. And let's move forward to another concept always related to the Bind Directive. So the Bind Directive works a bit differently when we use attributes that use a Boolean value. So it will show the attribute only if the property's value is true, otherwise it won't show anything. In all other cases, it won't render the attribute and its content. Let's see an example with a button, and that's the attribute that I'm talking about. So this can be disabled or not. So we could have a disabled property if we use the vbind directive over here. So vbind, okay, this can be true or false. If it's true, we expect to see disabled and its value. If it's false, we don't want to see it. But as I said, it works a bit differently. So let's try inside this data object to add some new properties. So the disabled property, and we set it to true. Let's see now. We should see this button. Of course, we need to put something inside the button. Okay, so we have this button and the button is disabled. As you can see, if we expect the page, we have the disabled attribute and its content. But as I said, if we for instance change this to false, of course we won't see the attribute at all. So let's see, we have just the button with no attributes. If we change this to, for instance, null, that's pretty much the same result. and you see we have no attribute. And if we change this to undefined, for instance, we have always the same result. Okay, so it works kind of differently. So if it's true, this is shown, otherwise in all other in any other option is not gonna be onto the page. So only if it's set to true is going to be come visible and render its content onto the page. So this is something to keep in mind while we work with such attributes. Another thing to consider is that bindings can include a single JavaScript expression with some restrictions. So this can be an expression, a JavaScript expression, but all the expressions are allowed. And only a single expression is allowed. We cannot use statements, we cannot use flow control tools like if or while, but we can only use, for instance, the ternary operator. And if you want to read more about this content, this topic, you will find the link under the video inside the description. And so let's quickly move forward to the next topic. We have seen so far only two directives for Vue, which is the vHTML and the vBind, but there are of course more directive. And just to name a few, we have the vElse, vIf, vElseIf, v-for, vOn, and as you can imagine, all the directives starts with this prefix. And every time you see it, you know that this is a Vue directive. But for vBind and vOn, so for these two directives, we have a shortened version of the syntax. And let me show you what I mean. So down here, let's add again a link. So we have a link and we have an href. Let's say we want to bind using the classic vBind directive syntax. So we can say vBind column href, and here we can say URL. Okay, this is the long syntax. A short version of the syntax is going to be this one. We can simply omit the vBind directive and just leave the column and then the name of the attribute, and that will understand, Vue will understand that we want to use the vBind directive. And the other one, the other directive that has a shorthand property, a shorthand syntax, is the vOn directive. Let's see it. So with a link, and then we say, for instance, vOn. We don't need the href. No. So we say the vOn, and then we say click equal to run something. Okay, so this is the long version of the syntax, and the short syntax is going to be this one, simply using the @ sign. So we have these two syntax, and you will see them very often while we work on our project. But so let's move a bit forward, because we have these two directives, and these directives, as you see, we have here defined the attribute for the href, and the same thing we did here for the click, but we could also have something that it's called dynamic arguments. So directives can have dynamic arguments since Vue 2.6, and we can use a JavaScript expression inside the directive if we wrap it inside the square brackets. Let me show you what I mean, but before this, there are some restrictions for that, and These are the only expression. The expression should evaluate to a string, and space and quotes are invalid. Let's see that in action. So we used before this long syntax. Let's copy that. So we have, I did do that. Okay, so we have the vBind directive and it's binding the href now. But what if we want this to be dynamic, something we defined inside the view instance, and then based on what we assign as value to this property, it changes. So we can do that using the square brackets, and then inside here we can define the attribute name. Let's call it attribute name, so it's easy to understand for you now. Dynamic argument. So now what is going to happen is that this is a simple JavaScript expression, so it will look for this property inside the data object. And if it finds it, it knows that we want to bind to a specific element, so a specific attribute. So here we could have inside the data object the attribute name. So this attribute name is going to be, of course, since we want to have an URL, we can say here href. So this is going to be the href. But we also have, so this is also this one is a JavaScript expression. So this URL is going to be also another property inside our data object. And in here we can say something like a website address. Okay, so now what's going to happen in this case is that we will see this link and it will have an href attribute and an URL assigned to it. So this will render the attribute named href and its value dynamically because we use the vBind directive. Let's see, here we have a link. Let's comment this out. Here we are. Okay, we have this link. Let's inspect it, and as you see, it has an href attribute, and its value is this one, same that we defined. So this is one of the things that we can do on directives, and specifically on the vBind directive. But also the beyond directive as a dynamic events can have dynamic events. So for the first one we had dynamic arguments, and this one has dynamic events. Okay, so the same concept applies here to the other directive, the beyond directive. So far, we have seen the HTML, the vBind, and beyond directive that I will explain to you a bit later in the course. But for now, it's important to know that we can do that. So we have, of course, also here we can use the short syntax. So we could do that, and it's going to be the same. Okay, and the same applies to the event. So let's grab this event here and let's copy it over there. So let's see, we have, of course, we have a link which has the beyond directive. So this is kind of an event listener, and it listens for clicks. When we click, we run something that is inside the quotes, that is a JavaScript expression, and it understand it as a method. So it runs this function. Let's create a dynamic event. In this case, we said we have a click, but in case we want a dynamic event, we can use the square brackets and then say here event name. I'm going to call it event name and attribute name just to make the this topic clear, but you can call it as you want. So we now have inside inside this HTML tag, we first, of course, the whole structure. We have div element with an ID of app, which is our root, and then inside it we have an anchor tag, and this anchor tag has the Bind directive in it. And after the directive, we have to specify the event that we want to assign to this directive. But in this case, we use the square brackets, and instead of after the colon using the event that we want to trigger, we say event name. So it's going to be a dynamic property, a dynamic event, so a property which we will define inside our data object. And so this event name is going to be something that we define in here. So after that, of course, we have the usual stuff. So this is a JavaScript expression because we are using a directive, and it will look for something called the run function inside our view instance, and we will have to create it to make this work. So now let's go inside the view instance and let's see how to make this work. So we said that we have an event name. So this event name must be something here, like we did for the attribute name. We do the same thing for the event. And the event is going to be click, can be also a different event, but for now, let's see the click. We need to remember that we need a comma to separate each property because we are inside an object. So now what else do we need? We need something that happen when we click on this link. So we could have a function when we need to write this function here. And where should we write it? I'll explain to you what I'm doing later, but for now, just follow along. So this is going to be methods, and in here we have this run function, and then in here we just log to the console test click function. So this is the function that we will trigger when the user clicks on our link, that this link has nothing in it. So let's say click me. Okay, and we'll review this code in a minute. So this is the link that we want to click. Okay, so if we click here, and let's of course open the console, and if we don't have any error, okay, there are no errors. So if we click here, this is not shown as a link because there is no href property. So we could change this into some different HTML tag, but I'll keep it as a link for now. So if I click, I'll see you see that we have this on the console that increases. So we click, every time we click, we see this test click function. So our function is working. So this dynamic event worked. So let's see what's inside here. So the first thing that we did, of course, is have this view instance, and then we add an event name property right here. Okay, we have this event name property inside the data object, and we assign to it a value, and the value is a click. This is the event that we will listen for. And finally, we say that the Bind directive runs a function when the event is triggered. Therefore, we need to write a method inside our view instance. So inside the methods object, we created a new function called run function that will simply output a message inside the console. Of course, for now we are using these dynamic events, but you might understand how this is going to work if we, of course, change to mouse over, mouse enter. Okay, if we changed it to a different event, it's going to work and it's going to change dynamically what event this link should listen for. So now that since we use the method for this function, it's a good time I think to talk about methods and what they are and why I place the run function inside the methods object. So I'll see you in the next video.